Hi everybody! Welcome to another Storytime with Sid. It is me, Sidney of Hightower, as it is every week, and here we are again with another story. Now this one is one that I read a while ago, not on Portal, not like this. I read it myself personally and I thought it was strange. I just thought how strange it was, and now that we're nearing the end of the book, I'm like, well, maybe it's time for me to revisit that one, because while it's strange, it's definitely interesting, and it's definitely a story worth hearing, and hopefully it'll be able to teach us a moral that we can look on and think, huh, okay. So, let's get started with the story. This one is called Little Claus and Big Claus. There was a town where two men had the very same name. Both of them were named Claus, but one owned 4 horses while the other had only 1. In order to tell them apart, people called the man with 4 horses Big Claus, and the other man with only 1 horse Little Claus. Now we're going to hear what happened between those two, because this is a real story. All week long, Little Claus had to do the plowing for Big Claus, lending him his only horse. Then Big Claus would help him in return with all 4 of his horses, but only once a week, and that was on Sunday. Hee-yah! How Little Claus would crack his whip at all 5 horses. They all might as well have belonged to him on that one day. The sun shone so wondrously, and all the bells in the tower rang, summoning people to church. Everyone was dressed in their best, walking with their hymnals under their arms, on their way to hear the pastor preach. And they looked at Little Claus, who was plowing with 5 horses, and he was so pleased that he cracked his whip again and shouted, "Giddy up, all my horses!" "You shouldn't say that," said Big Claus. "Only one of those horses is yours." But when someone else passed by on his way to church, Little Claus forgot that he wasn't supposed to say that and shouted, "Giddy up, all my horses!" "All right, now I really must ask you to stop doing that," said Big Claus. "Because if you say it one more time, I'm going to strike your horse in the forehead and he'll drop dead on the spot, and that will be the end of him." "Well, I certainly won't say it again," said Little Claus. But when people came past and nodded hello, he was so pleased and thought it looked so splendid that he had 5 horses plowing his field that he cracked his whip and shouted, "Giddy up, all my horses!" "I'll giddy up your horse," said Big Claus. And he seized a tethering mallet and struck Little Claus's only horse in the forehead so that it fell down out to the ground, stone dead. "Oh, now I have no horse at all," said Little Claus, and began to cry. Later he flayed the horse and let the hide dry in the wind, and he stuffed it in a sack that he hoisted onto his back, and set off for town to sell his horsehide. He had such a long way to go. He had to pass through a big, dark forest, and a terrible storm came up. He completely lost his way, and before he found the right road, dusk had fallen, and it was much too far to reach to town or go back home before night came. Close to the road stood a large farm. The shutters on all the windows were closed, and yet there was a glimpse of light above. "Surely they'll let me spend the night there," thought Little Claus, and he went over and knocked. The farmer's wife opened the door, but when she heard what he wanted, she told him to keep on going. Her husband wasn't home, and she didn't take in strangers. "Well, then I guess I'll have to sleep outside," said Little Claus, and the farmer's wife shut the door in his face. Nearby stood a big haystack, and between the haystack and the house, a little shed that had been built with a flat thatched roof. "I can sleep up there," said Little Claus, and when he saw the roof, "That would make a lovely bed, and I'm sure the stork isn't going to fly down and bite me on the leg." A real-life stork was standing on the roof where it made a nest. So Little Claus climbed up to the shed, lay down, and turned on his side to settle properly. The wooden shutters on the windows of the house didn't quite meet the top, which meant that he could peek into the room. A great feast had been laid out with wine and a roast and such a lovely fish. The farmer's wife and the deacon were sitting at the table all alone. She was pouring wine for him, and he began with the fish because he was awfully fond of fish. "If only I could have a bite too," said Little Claus, cramming his neck towards the window. Lord, what a lovely cake he could see in there. Oh yes, it was quite a feast. Then he heard someone come riding along towards the house. It was the woman's husband on his way home. Now it's true that he was a good man, but he had a strange affliction. He couldn't stand to see deacons. If he caught sight of a deacon, he would grow quite furious. That was also why the deacon had come to visit the woman when he knew that her husband wasn't home, and that's why the good woman had set out for him the best food she could offer. When they heard her husband coming, they were both terrified. The woman told the deacon to climb into a big empty chest that stood in the corner, which he did, because he knew full well that the poor man couldn't stand the sight of a deacon. The woman quickly hid all the wonderful food and wine inside her baking oven, because if her husband saw it, he was sure to ask what was going on. "Oh no," said little Claus, up on the shed when he saw the food disappear. "Is somebody up there?" asked the farmer, peering up at little Claus. "Why are you lying up there? Come in the house." Then little Claus told him that he'd lost his way and asked he might stay the night. "Yes, of course," said the farmer, "but first we'll have a bite to eat." The woman welcomed them both, set dishes on a long table, and brought them a big bowl of porridge. The farmer was hungry and ate with gusto, but little Claus couldn't help thinking about the wonderful roast fish and cake that he knew were hidden in the oven. Under the table at his feet, he had put the sack with the horsehide in it, because we know, after all, this is what he had brought from home to sell in town. The porridge was not at all to his liking, and so he stepped in his sack, and the dry horsehide inside creaked quite loudly. "Hush!" said little Claus to his sack, but at the same instant he stepped on it again, and it creaked even louder than before. "Tell me what you have in your bag," said the farmer. "Oh, it's a troll," said little Claus. "He says we shouldn't eat the porridge because he has conjured a whole oven full of roast fish and cake." "Is that right?" said the farmer, and quickly opened the oven. There he saw all the wonderful food that his wife had hidden, but he now thought the troll in the bag had conjured it up. His wife didn't say a word, but set the food on the table at once, and so they ate the fish and the roast and the cake. Then little Claus stepped on his sack again, making the hide creak. "What's he saying now?" said the farmer. "He says," little Claus, "that he has also conjured up 3 bottles of wine for us, and they're standing over in the corner by the oven." Then the woman had to bring out the wine that she had hidden, and the farmer drank and grew quite merry. A troll like the one little Claus had in his bag was something that he would certainly like to own. "Can he also conjure up the devil?" asked the farmer. "That's someone I'd really like to see now that I'm feeling so merry." "Yes," said little Claus. "My troll can do anything I ask. Isn't that right?" he said as he stepped on the bag, making it creak. "Did you hear him say yes? But the devil looks so horrid that you wouldn't want to look at him." "Oh, I'm not the least bit afraid. How bad do you think he could look?" "Well, he's going to look exactly like a deacon." "Whoa," said the farmer. "That's ghastly, all right. I must tell you that I can't stand the sight of deacons, but that doesn't matter, because I'll know it's the devil, so it won't bother me as much. I'm feeling brave now, but don't let him come too close." "Let me ask my troll," said little Claus, and he stepped on the bag, cupping his ear. "What does he say?" "He says you can go over and open the chest that's standing in the corner, and you'll see the devil moping inside, but you have to hold on to the lid so it doesn't get out." "Come on, and help me hold on to it," said the farmer, and he went over to the chest where his wife had hidden the real deacon, who sat there completely terrified. The farmer lifted the lid slightly and peeked inside. "Whoa!" he yelled, jumping back. "I saw him all right, and he looks just like our deacon. That was terrible." After that, they had to have a drink, and then they kept on drinking until late into the night. "You got to sell me that troll," said the farmer. "Ask whatever price you like. Why, I'd even give you a whole bushel full of money." "No, I can't do that," said Claus. "Just think how much I'll gain from owning this troll." "Oh, but I'd certainly like to have it," said the farmer, and he kept on begging. "All right," said little Claus. "Since you've been kind enough to give me shelter for the night, I can't refuse. You have the troll and for a bushel of money, but I want the bushel to be full to the brim." "And that's what you'll get," said the farmer. "But you have to take that chest over there with you. I refuse to have it in the house for even an hour longer. There's no telling whether he's still inside." Little Claus gave the farmer a sack with the dried horsehide and got in return a whole bushel full of money, full to the brim. The farmer even presented him with a big wheelbarrow for carrying the money and the chest. "Farewell," said little Claus, and then he set off with his money and the big chest in which the deacon was sitting. On the other side of the woods was a big, deep river. The water was running so fast it was almost impossible to swim against the current. A big new bridge had been built to cross it. Little Claus stopped in the middle of the bridge and said very loudly to the deacon inside the chest so he would hear him, "Well, what do I need this stupid chest for? It's so heavy it feels like it's full of rocks. I'm getting awfully tired of carting it around, so I think I'll throw it in the river. If it floats to me, that's fine, but if it doesn't matter at all." Then he grabbed one handle of the chest and lifted it slightly, as if he were going to shove it in the water. "No, stop!" yelled the deacon inside the chest. "Let me out!" "Ooh," said Little Claus, pretending to be scared. "He's still inside! I've got to toss it in the river as quick as I can so he'll drown!" "Oh, no, 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 no!" shouted the deacon. "I'll give you a whole bushel full of money if you don't." "Well, that's a different story," said Little Claus, and opened the chest. The deacon crawled out at once, shoved the empty chest into the water, and went off to his house, where he gave Little Claus a whole bushel full of money. Little Claus already had 1 bushel from the farmer. Now his whole wheelbarrow was full of money. "Look at that! I certainly did get a good price for that horse," he said to himself when he came back to his own house and dumped all the money on a big heap in the middle of the floor. "Big Claus will be annoyed when he finds out how rich I've become from only 1 horse, but I'm not going to come right out and tell him about it." Then he sent a boy over to Big Claus to borrow a bushel measure. "I wonder what he wants it for," thought Big Claus, and smeared tar inside the bottom so that a little of whatever was being weighed would stick to it. And it did, because when he got the bushel measure back, there were 3 new silver 8-skilling coins stuck to it. "What's this?" said Big Claus, and he ran right over to see Little Claus. "Where'd you get all this money?" "Oh, I got it from the horsehide I sold last night." "That was certainly a good price," said Big Claus, and he raced back home, picked up an axe, and struck every one of his 4 horses on the forehead. Then he skinned them and drove into town with the hides. "Hides, hides! Who wants to buy hides?" he shouted through all the streets. All the shoemakers and tanners came running and asked him how much he wanted for the hides. "A bushel full of money for each of them," said Big Claus. "Are you crazy?" they all said. "Do you think we have bushels of money?" "Hides, hides! Who wants to buy hides?" he shouted again. But to everyone who asked how much the hides cost, he replied, "A bushel full of money." "He's trying to make fools of us," they all said. Then the shoemakers picked up their straps and the tanners with their aprons, and they started beating Big Claus. "Hides, hides!" they jeered at him. "Oh yes, we'll give you a hide that bleeds like a pig. Now get out of town!" they shouted, and Big Claus had to rush off as fast as he could. He had never been beaten so badly in his life. "Well," he said when he got home, "Little Claus is going to pay for this. I'm going to murder him for this." But back at Little Claus's house, his grandmother had just died. Now it's true that she had been terribly ill-tempered and mean towards him, but even so he was quite sad. He took the dead woman and put her in his warm bed to see whether she might come back to life. There she would lie all night long while he slept in the corner, sitting in his chair. That was something he had done before. As he was sitting there that night, the door opened and Big Claus came in with the axe. He knew where Little Claus's bed stood, and he went right over it and struck the dead grandmother on the forehead, thinking it was Little Claus. "Take that!" he said. "Now you won't make a fool of me any more." And he went back home. "What a mean and evil man," said Little Claus. "He wanted to murder me. But it's a good thing that old lady was already dead, or we would have taken her life." Then he dressed his old grandmother in her Sunday best, borrowed a horse from his neighbor, harnessed it to his wagon, and put his old grandmother on the back seat so she wouldn't fall out when he started driving. Then they headed off through the woods. When the sun came up, they were outside a big inn where Little Claus stopped and went inside to get a bite to eat. The innkeeper was very, very rich, and he was also a good man, but hot-tempered, and as if there were pepper and tobacco inside of him. "Good morning," he said to Little Claus. "You put on your fine clothes awfully early today." "Yes," said Little Claus. "I'm going to town with my old grandmother. She's sitting outside in the wagon, and I can't get her to come indoors. Would you mind taking her a glass of mead? But you'll have to speak up because she doesn't hear very well." "Why, certainly," said the innkeeper. He poured a big glass of meat and took it outside to the dead grandmother, who was propped up in a wagon. "Here's a glass of meat from your grandson," said the innkeeper. But the dead woman didn't say a word, just sat there without moving. "Didn't you hear me?" shouted the innkeeper as loud as he could. "Here's a glass of meat from your grandson!" Once again he shouted the same thing, and then one more time. But when she didn't budge in the slightest, he got angry and tossed a glass of meat right at her face so it ran down her nose, and she toppled over backward into the wagon because she'd merely been propped up and wasn't tied down. "What's this?" shouted Little Claus as he came running out the door and grabbed the innkeeper by the shirt front. "You've gone and killed my grandmother! Just look at that big hole in her forehead!" "Oh, what bad luck!" cried the innkeeper, wringing his hands. "It's all fault of my bad temper. Dear Little Claus, I'll give you a whole bushel full of money and pay for your grandmother's burial as if she were my own. But don't say a word or they'll chop off my head, and that would be awful." So Little Claus got a whole bushel full of money, and the innkeeper buried the old grandmother as if she were his own. As soon Little Claus got back home with all the money, he at once sent his boy over to see Big Claus to ask if he could borrow his bushel measure. "What's this?" said Big Claus. "I thought I killed him! I'm going to have to see this for myself." And so he took the bushel measure over to Little Claus in person. "Where on earth did you get all that money?" he asked, opening his eyes wide when he saw how much Little Claus had accumulated. "It was my grandmother, not me, you killed," said Little Claus. "But now I've sold her for a bushel full of money." "That was certainly a good price," said Big Claus, and he rushed home, picked up an axe, and promptly killed his old grandmother. He put her in his wagon, drove into town to the apothecary shop, and asked him whether or not he wanted to buy a dead body. "Who is it, and where did you get it?" said the apothecary. "It's my grandmother," said Big Claus. "I've killed her for a bushel full of money." "Good Lord," said the apothecary. "You don't know what you're saying. Don't say things like that or you could lose your head." And then he told him exactly what a dreadful evil thing he had done, and what a bad person he was, and that he ought to be punished. Big Claus was so scared that he leaped straight from the apothecary's shop into his wagon, cracked his whip at the horses, and raced off home. The apothecary and everyone else thought he was mad, and so they let him go where he liked. "You're going to pay for this," said Big Claus when he was out on the road. "Oh yes, you're going to pay for this, Little Claus." As soon as he got home, he took the biggest sack he could find and went over to Little Claus and said, "You've made a fool of me again! First I killed my horses and then my old grandmother. It's all your fault, but you're never going to trick me again." And he grabbed Little Claus around the waist and stuffed him into his sack. Then he slung him over his back and shouted, "Now I'm going to take you out and drown you!" It was a long walk to reach the river, and Little Claus wasn't easy to carry. The road passed over very, very close to the church, where the organ was playing and people were singing so beautifully inside. Then Big Claus put down his sack holding Little Claus right next to the church door, thinking that it might do him some good to go inside and listen to a hymn first before continuing on his way. Little Claus couldn't get out, and everyone else was in church, so Big Claus went inside. "Oh me, oh my," sighed Little Claus from inside the sack. He twisted and turned, but it was impossible for him to loosen the cord. At that moment, an old cattle driver with chalk-white hair and a big walking stick came by. He was driving a big herd of cows and bulls in front of him. They trampled over the sack that Claus was in, tumbling it onto its side. "Oh my," sighed Little Claus. "I'm so young and I'm already headed for heaven." "And what a poor man am I," said the cattle driver. "Here I am so old, and yet my time is not ready. I'm not ready to go." "Open the sack," shouted Little Claus. "Climb in and take my place, and you'll end up in heaven at once." "Oh, I like that very much," said the cattle driver, untying the sack, and Little Claus jumped right out. "Could you take care of the cattle?" said the old man, and he climbed into the bag, which Little Claus tied up and then went on his way, taking the cows and bulls. A little while later, Big Claus came out of the church and hoisted the sack onto his back, thinking that it certainly was a lot lighter, because the old cattle driver was no more than half the weight of Little Claus. "How easy it is to carry him now! Well, that's probably because I was listening to a hymn." Then he went over to the river, which was deep and wide, and threw the sack with the old cattle driver into the water and shouted after him, thinking he was little Claus. "Take that! Now you won't be making a fool of me anymore." Then he headed home, but when he came to the crossroads, he met little Claus walking with all his cattle. "What's this? Didn't I drown you?" "Yes, you did," said little Claus. "You threw me in the river less than half an hour ago." "But where did you get all these wonderful cattle?" asked Big Claus. "They're sea cattle," said little Claus. "Let me tell you the whole story. And by the way, thanks for drowning me, because now I'm back on my feet, and let me tell you, I'm as rich as can be. I was so scared when I was inside that sack, but the wind whistled in my ears when you threw me off the bridge into the cold water. I sank straight to the bottom. But I didn't hurt myself because the loveliest soft grass grows down there. That's where I landed, and the bag was opened at once. The loveliest maiden wearing chalk-white clothing and with a green wreath on her wet hair took my hand and said, 'Is that you, little Claus? Well, first let me give you these cattle. 5 miles up the road there's another whole herd that I want you to have.' Then I saw the river was a great highway for the sea folk. Down on the bottom they were walking and driving all the way from the sea toward land to the place where the river ends. It was so lovely with flowers and freshness of grass, the fish swimming in the water. They flitted around my ears like birds in the air. How handsome the people were, and how many cattle there were, ambling along the ditches and fences." "But why did you come back to us so soon?" said Big Claus. "That's not what I would have done, and it was so charming down there." "Well, you see," said little Claus, "it was really very cunning of me. You heard me say that the mermaid told me that 5 miles up the road, and by road she means river, of course, since she can't travel any other way, there is a whole herd of cattle waiting for me. I happen to know where the river starts to bend, first one way and then the other, making a whole detour. It's much shorter. If you can do it, to come up here on land and head straight across to the river, that's why I saved almost 2.5 miles and reached my sea cattle much quicker." "Oh, you certainly are a lucky man," said Big Claus. "Do you think I could get some sea cattle too, if I went down to the bottom of the river?" "Oh yes, I imagine so," said little Claus. "But I can't carry you in a sack to the river. You're much too heavy for me. But if you walk there yourself and climb into the bag, I'd be more than happy to throw you in." "Thanks so much," said Big Claus. "But if I don't get any sea cattle when I get there, I'm going to give you a beating, believe me." "Oh, don't be so mean." And they went down to the river. The cattle were so thirsty that when they saw the water, they ran as fast as they could down to the slope to drink. "Look how fast they're moving," said little Claus. "They're longing to go back down to the bottom." "Yes, but help me first," said Big Claus. "Otherwise I'll give you a beating." And then he climbed into the big sack that was lying across the back of one of the bulls. Put a rock inside, because otherwise I'm afraid I won't sink," said Big Claus. "Oh, I'm sure you will," said little Claus. But just the same, he put a big rock in the sack, tied the cord tight, and then gave it a shove. Plop! Big Claus landed in the river and promptly sank to the bottom. "I'm afraid he's not going to find any cattle," said little Claus. And then he headed home with all he had. And that was Big Claus and Little Claus. See what I mean when I say it's a little strange? It's just a little strange because there's so much murder. Not like the other stories we haven't read haven't had a lot of murder, because I certainly wasn't expecting that, but here we are. But the moral of the story is to outwit your bullies, which is fine. I don't think resorting to murder is a good way to handle anything, but, if outwitting your bullies is, your lesson here, then yeah, brains will always beat out brawn. For the most part. But it's certainly very interesting. Little Claus is definitely a trickster, which you don't expect at the beginning of the story. He kind of strikes me as like a Loki type character, except not exactly a god. But it's still very interesting to see. I like reading about smart characters because clever characters are just so intriguing because you get to see how their mind works as they're doing the things that they're doing, which is incredibly entertaining. So I love like little trickster characters, as long as they don't trick me. But then again, if someone told me to jump into a sack and sink down to the bottom of the river, I think I'm smart enough to not. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the story. Next week will be our last fairy tale in this series, and then I will be hopping over to spooky tales of the like for October, and then after that we will be moving on to American folklore. So I hope you're excited for that, and I hope that you are staying happy, healthy, and safe. Thank you so much for joining me today.